August 14, 2025. 2 hours 17 minutes and 33 seconds, the timestamp in the corner is jittering slightly, a pale green against the deep black of the recording. The audio is mostly static and the sound of heavy breathing. Testing, a low, gruff voice mutters. This is Dale Kincaid's recording, taken deep in the foothills bordering the Olympic National Forest. He'd kept the camera running since the noise started. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a landslide. It was a shearing sound, a metal scream that cut the air, followed by a shockwave that rattled the glass in his remote cabin, 40 miles from the nearest paved road. The camera shifts, catching the low-fidelity view of the cabin porch. Dale is framed briefly, his worried face illuminated by the flickering camera screen. He clicks the infrared filter on, turning the world into sickly green. I got the rifle, I got the recorder. Whatever that was, it didn't sound friendly. Sounded like the sky tore open. I'm heading toward the ridge, following the sound line. If this is a bear, I apologize to the tape gods. If it's something else, well, somebody needs to document the end of the world. He steps off the porch, the wet ground sucking at his worn boots. The static on the microphone spikes sharply, followed by an impossible, faint hum beneath the sound of crickets. August 14, 2025. 2 hours 35 minutes and 9 seconds, Dale is navigating thick brush, the camera strapped awkwardly to his shoulder, creating a jerking, dizzying motion. He's breathing hard. The air, usually clean and cold, is now thick with the smell of ozone and something metallic, like burnt copper mixed with wet limestone. The trees are fine here, no sign of fire, he narrates, pausing to scan the thick canopy above. But the temperature, it dropped 20 degrees in 5 minutes. And that smell. Not local. Definitely not local. He pans the camera down, showing his heavy boots crunching pine needles. He trips over a root, and the image briefly spins into vertical lines of digital noise before stabilizing. When the image clears, he has reached the property line marker, a crude wire fence he rarely checks. Beyond the fence, the trees begin to look unnatural. Their leaves are singed, curled inwards, and several massive hemlocks are inexplicably sheared off halfway up their trunks, looking like splintered matchsticks. This wasn't weather damage. This was catastrophic, surgical impact. August 14, 2025. 2 hours 48 minutes and 11 seconds, Dale pushes past the last standing cedar, and the field of view opens onto unimaginable destruction. The camera holds steady for a moment, capturing the sheer scale. A crater, roughly 50 feet wide, gouges the earth. The impact site isn't neatly circular, it's elongated, suggesting a low, rapid trajectory. The ground is churned earth and scorched rock, steaming slightly in the cold night air. The heat signature is massive, overwhelming the camcorder's thermal settings, causing the bright green image to bloom with white distortion at the center of the pit. Jesus Christ, Dale whispers, the mic barely picking up the sound over the continuous, low-frequency hum that now permeates the area. That wasn't a plane. That was a torpedo hitting the damn mountain. He slowly approaches the rim, the rifle held loose at his side, momentarily forgotten in sheer awe. Small, flickering light sources appear in the center of the crater, reflecting off something jagged and dark that protrudes from the mud, metal, but colored like polished obsidian, reflecting the sickly green infrared light. August 14, 2025. 2 hours 53 minutes and 50 seconds, Dale edges down the slope, finding better footing. The camera dips, focuses on strange, gelatinous tracks running parallel to the edge of the crater, not paw prints, not boot prints, but smeared lines that shimmer faintly. He follows them with the lens, the tracking leading towards a cluster of shattered pine stumps at the northern lip of the pit. He stops abruptly, inhaling sharply. The camera registers the movement instantly. Huddled amidst the debris, partially hidden by the organic shrapnel of a pulverized log, is a figure. It's too tall, too thin, and utterly motionless. Dale's breathing hitches, turning ragged and loud in the microphone. The rifle comes up slowly. The safety clicking off, a sound loud enough to cut through the hum. The figure has a subtle reflectivity to its clothing, but the overall outline is distinctly humanoid, albeit stretched and attenuated. It remains completely still, seemingly oblivious to Dale's presence. "Don't move," Dale manages, the command barely above a choked whisper, knowing the entity wouldn't understand English anyway. His hand holding the camera is visibly shaking, making the timestamp rock back and forth violently. August 14, 2025. 2 hours 55 minutes and 4 seconds, Dale takes 3 slow, measured steps closer. The figure moves, a weak, convulsive shudder that ripples down its frame. The camera catches the details, the pale, near-white skin reflecting the IR light sharply, the unnatural sheen of the torn suit. The most shocking detail is the arm. It is bent at a ghastly angle, pinned beneath a heavy piece of the obsidian-like hull fragment. A dark, viscous fluid, not red, but a deep, shimmering violet, is slowly pooling onto the muddy ground beneath the injury. The entity is biologically wounded, undeniably in pain, and clearly stranded. The large, smooth black eyes, which seem to absorb all light, flick up suddenly, fixing on the camera lens. There is no aggression, only profound shock and pain. The low hum intensifies into a brief, painful whine captured by the mic, followed by extreme audio clipping. Dale lowers the rifle slightly, instinct overriding panic. This was not a monster. This was a wreck victim. August 14, 2025. 2 hours 56 minutes and 59 seconds, Look, I don't know what you are, but you're hurt, Dale says, his voice surprisingly gentle despite the terror churning in his stomach. He slowly raises his empty left hand, palm open, trying to convey non-aggression. The entity tracks the movement, its head tilting slightly, an owl-like movement. It produces a sound, a thin, reedy whistle followed by a desperate clicking noise that vibrates the air. It's clearly vocalizing distress or perhaps attempting communication. Dale realizes the rifle, now held loosely by his right hip, is still a major threat. He makes the conscious, irreversible decision. He slowly, deliberately, shoulders the rifle and leans it carefully against the nearest stump, keeping the camcorder running. This gesture seems to register. The entity's breathing, which Dale can now faintly hear, is shallow and rapid. Okay, buddy. We need to get that thing off your arm." He takes another tentative step into the crater. The mud is slick, and he almost falls, the camera jerking wildly. He focuses the lens on the large shard of wreckage pinning the alien's arm. It's too heavy for him to move easily. The scene fades to static as the camera runs out of battery, the timestamp freezing on the screen. August 18, 2025. 17 hours 41 minutes and 9 seconds, the camcorder shakes violently, Dale's breathing ragged and loud, crackling against the cheap microphone. He dropped the camcorder briefly in the mud, and the lens now had a smear across the lower right quadrant, making the iridescent sheen of the wreckage and the injured entity even more warped and surreal. The entity, long and unervingly pale, was completely inert. Dale moved closer, his heavy frame crunching pine needles and splintered composite material. The massive gash across the alien's torso, running diagonally from the shoulder down to the hip, had slowed its bleeding significantly, but the sheer volume of the unusual, oil-slick fluid soaking the torn iridescent flight suit suggested massive internal damage. He noticed the skin beneath the suit was translucent white, like polished marble, allowing faint blue branching veins to be mapped beneath the surface. He fought the urge to vomit. This wasn't some government black project, this was unequivocally non-human. Paranoia, Dale's lifelong companion, suddenly morphed into justified terror. If they, whoever they were, caused this crash, they would certainly be looking for survivors or salvage. If Dale was found here, near this wreckage, he wouldn't just be questioned, he'd be disappeared. The entity wasn't a threat right now, discovery was the threat. He had to move it, and he had to move it now. He looked down the length of the 6 feet 5 inches figure, its enormous black eyes fixed yet lifeless. And knew the only way was to drag it. He grabbed a thick, shredded piece of the ship's bulkhead liner, a flexible polymer sheet, and began tearing it loose to use as an improvised sled. August 18, 2025. 17 hours 58 minutes and 33 seconds, Dale managed to roll the alien onto the improvised polymer sled. Despite the alien's slender appearance, the sheer density of its biomass made the effort backbreaking. His faded blue work shirt was already dark with sweat beneath the suspenders, sticking to the white undershirt underneath. Every heave was accompanied by a wet, pulling sound as the slick material dragged over the mud and moss. The path back to his cabin was steep and overgrown, and Dale had to constantly readjust his grip on the polymer sheet, tying the corners together with strips of heavy duct tape salvaged from his gear bag. He kept the camcorder running, clipped precariously to the shoulder strap of his suspenders, mostly capturing the ground blurring past, interspersed with sharp, jarring glimpses of the alien's head bouncing slightly. The black eyes, Dale noted with a fresh wave of panic, seemed to reflect the canopy light with unnatural intensity. Suddenly, as Dale rested, gasping for air, a small, barely perceptible tremor ran through the entity's long frame. One of its 3 elongated fingers twitched, flexing against the damp fabric. It was alive. Dale pressed his hand against the entity's pale neck, searching for a pulse, but found only skin that felt strangely cold, like freshwater stone. The twitch, however faint, confirmed his horrific obligation. He yanked the sled forward again, urging himself faster, knowing the window of safety was closing rapidly. August 18, 2025. 18 hours 31 minutes and 17 seconds, the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the western ridges, casting long, fractured shadows that played tricks on Dale's periphery. The isolation that usually brought him solace now felt like a suffocating trap. He paused near the creek, the halfway point back to his cabin. He looked back at the trail. The polymer sled had carved an ugly furrow through the moss and ferns, a beacon pointing directly to his only refuge. He grabbed handfuls of pine needles and damp earth, clumsily attempting to brush out the deepest grooves, but it was a futile gesture. He was too exposed. He muttered to the camcorder, his voice low and choked, almost lost in the tape hiss, gotta get him inside. This is stupid, Dale. Stupid, stupid, stupid. He checked the time again. Less than an hour of good light left. He worried about the integrity of the entity, its massive, unnatural injury. Was he causing more damage dragging it like this? He felt the weight of monumental guilt, compounded by the certainty that he had lost his mind. Yet, the physical reality, the weight, the smell of ozone and iridescent fluid, anchored him to this new, terrifying reality. He pulled the sled into the creek bed, letting the water momentarily cleanse some of the debris, before hoisting it up the final incline towards the overgrown clearing where his dilapidated shack stood. August 18, 2025. 19 hours 2 minutes and 51 seconds, the cabin came into view, a rough-hewn structure, barely more than a reinforced shed, deep in the Washington woods. Dale pulled the entity around the back, bypassing the main door. He hadn't used the small, attached storage room in years. It was just 4 walls filled with forgotten tools and damp firewood, accessible only through a low, hinged hatch leading off his small utility porch. It was dusty, spiderweb choked, and utterly hidden. Perfect. Working quickly, fueled by pure adrenaline and fear, he managed to maneuver the sled up the porch steps. Getting the 6 feet 5 inches figure through the low hatch was an agonizing exercise in leverage. He had to bend the entity's long legs sharply, apologizing quietly under his breath to the unconscious form, a surreal moment of mundane courtesy directed at an interdimensional casualty. Finally, the entity was fully concealed within the dark, musty room. Dale slammed the hatch shut, replacing the heavy tool trunk he used to block it from the inside. He grabbed his short-handled axe and drove 2 heavy-duty fence staples into the wood, securing the hatch for good. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the loud, persistent hum of the VHS camcorder and Dale's heavy, wheezing breaths. He leaned against the porch railing, tasting pine resin and metallic fear, his hands shaking too violently to steady the camera. August 18, 2025. 19 hours 25 minutes and 4 seconds, inside the cramped utility room, Dale fumbled for his headlamp, casting a harsh, conical beam across the pale form resting on the dirt floor. He knelt beside the alien, removing the sticky remnants of the polymer sled. He pulled away the torn iridescent fabric around the wound. The laceration was deep, running down into what looked like internal organ mass, but the edges were already curling in and sealing, not like human tissue healing, but like a strange, crystalline substance solidifying. The oil-slick fluid, the alien blood, had begun to form a thin, reflective crust over the area. He opened his dilapidated, military-issue first aid kit, antiseptic wipes, gauze, and some strong painkillers, aspirin, worthless for this, he figured. He hesitantly wiped the surrounding skin with an antiseptic wipe. The translucent white skin felt incredibly fine and cool to the touch. He leaned closer to the alien's head. The large, smooth black eyes remained open, reflecting the beam of his headlamp like 2 obsidian mirrors. He whispered, "I ain't gonna hurt ya, pal. Just gotta keep you quiet." He took a deep breath and gently bandaged the gash, using wide compression gauze simply to contain the odd metallic crusting, rather than to stop any flow. He knew, with terrifying certainty, that his human understanding of medicine was utterly useless here, but the ritual of care helped stabilize his rapidly fraying nerves. August 18, 2025. 20 hours 1 minute and 58 seconds, Dale stepped back outside, pulling the hatch closed again. Darkness was near complete, forcing the camcorder's automatic gain control to pump up the signal, coating everything in a thick layer of video noise and green hue. He had to neutralize the trail. He grabbed a wide garden rake and spent the next hour walking the perimeter of his property line, sweeping the ground where he'd dragged the body, scattering debris and dead leaves over the exposed dirt. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. He kept pausing, listening intently. It wasn't the sound of search parties he was listening for, but the absence of sound, the unnatural silence that sometimes precedes a deep woods intervention. Then he heard it, faint, far off, but unmistakable, the rhythmic, throbbing wash of rotary blades cutting the atmosphere. Helicopters. They were searching. They were methodical. He dropped the rake and sprinted back to the cabin, adrenaline spiking once more. He checked his ancient CB radio, static, nothing useful. He ripped the antenna cable out of the wall, cutting off any possibility of transmission, either his own or external interception. He slammed the shutters on his single cabin window and locked the bolt. For the first time since the crash, the reality of his situation crystallized. He was under siege, guarding a secret that exceeded any spy thriller or paranoid fantasy he'd ever consumed. August 18, 2025. 20 hours 45 minutes and 12 seconds, Dale sat heavily at his kitchen table, the camcorder resting on a stack of survival manuals, aimed at his face. The reflection of his small oil lamp shimmered in the lens. He looked older, defeated, his salt and pepper buzz cut damp, his faded blue work shirt clinging to his heavy frame. He hadn't eaten since morning. He grabbed a can of lukewarm chili and a stale cracker, chewing mechanically while staring blankly into the lens. "Well, that's it," he croaked, his voice hoarse and dry. "I went out looking for a little excitement, maybe a downed Cessna, and I brought home this. They'll be here soon. Military, whatever. They're circling." He paused, wiping a piece of cracker off his chin. "I made the choice. I could have left him, let them find the body, kept quiet. But, seeing that wound. That thing is just a kid, maybe. Or something helpless. Something they smashed out of the sky." He shook his head slowly. The paranoia was still there, buzzing like a trapped fly, but now it was overshadowed by a grim, fierce protectiveness. He grabbed his old deer rifle from the wall mount. The archiving of this event, the camcorder running, was his only defense, his only witness. He looked toward the utility room hatch. He was the caretaker now. For better or worse. For as long as he could keep them both alive. 11:47 and 4 seconds a.m. July 19, 2025. Dale leaned back on his heels, the stale smell of sawdust and damp earth heavy in the hidden room. The camera, perched precariously on a stack of old journals, captured the muted light filtering through the single, heavily curtained window. The entity lay absolutely still, the slender body stretched across the makeshift bed of blankets. The most severe injury wasn't the head trauma, which seemed superficial, but the deep, ragged tear running along the lower thigh. The iridescent flight suit was shredded there, revealing a slickness of translucent white skin underneath. Dale, heavy-set and breathing hard, pulled on a pair of rubber gloves from his old fishing kit. His human first aid knowledge was hitting a wall of profound biological failure. There was almost no blood, not the thick, red kind he expected, just a slow, weeping fluid that looked like diluted mercury, shimmering slightly in the gloom. He realized his standard gauze and iodine would be useless, perhaps even harmful. He needed sutures, industrial strength, and antibiotics for a system he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The visible blue veins beneath the white skin pulsed with an unnerving slowness. He reached out a trembling three-fingered hand, barely touching the wound's periphery, and the entity remained motionless, a chilling statue of pain. The sheer foreignness of the physiology was a paralyzing agent worse than fear of the authorities. This wasn't a wounded animal, this was an impossibly fragile, terrifying clockwork that Dale was one wrong move away from breaking. 12:35 and 19 seconds p.m. July 19, 2025. Dale had boiled water, enough to steam the small room, and was using strips of an old, clean cotton shirt as compresses. He wiped gently at the wound, trying to clear away whatever metallic dust or foreign particulate matter might be embedded in the flesh. The entity's skin felt cool and surprisingly resilient, like stretched silk over fine bone. As he applied pressure near the laceration, the faint blue veins beneath the surface seemed to flare slightly, contracting away from the pressure. It was the only visible response. Suddenly, a sound, a high, sharp intake of air, like static electricity snapping, came from the entity's chest cavity. Dale recoiled instantly, knocking the bowl of water and scalding his own hand. He cursed softly, clutching his burned flesh, but his focus snapped back to the alien. The smooth, reflective black eyes were still closed, yet the distress signal had been clear and mechanical. It wasn't human pain, it was the sound of a complex mechanism under acute duress. Dale waited, suspended in silence, listening to the cabin creak around him. He needed to stabilize the wound immediately, but the thought of stitching that skin, cutting into that structure, made his gut clench. He picked up the water bowl again, forcing his hands to be steady, whispering a low, gravelly reassurance that was entirely for his own benefit. The raw isolation of the cabin pressed down on him, amplifying the weight of this impossible responsibility. 1:10:55 p.m. July 19, 2025. The entity's head shifted, a slow, deliberate movement that tracked almost 45 degrees towards Dale. The eyes, previously closed, snapped open. They were vast, smooth expanses of reflective black, absorbing all the dim light of the room without reflecting anything back. They lacked any discernible pupil or iris, giving the impression of polished obsidian mirrors set into the skull. Dale froze mid-action, a piece of sterile cloth hovering inches from the wound. He had expected fear, or pain, or rage. He encountered only an intense, cold calculation. He felt completely dissected by that gaze. "All right there, partner," Dale muttered, his voice hoarse and sounding ridiculously folksy in the tense atmosphere. "I ain't gonna hurt ya. Just tryin' to patch you up." He lowered the cloth slowly, allowing the alien to watch the action. He moved with exaggerated slowness, demonstrating his intent. As the cloth touched the wound, a low, continuous vibration started emanating from the entity, not vocal, but mechanical, resonating through the floorboards. It felt like standing next to a poorly insulated power generator. The sound increased slightly when Dale began cleaning the laceration again, confirming it was a direct physiological response to stimulus. He worked under the absolute, terrifying scrutiny of the dark, unblinking eyes, realizing this being wasn't merely surviving, it was cataloging every single movement he made. 2:03:32 p.m. July 19, 2025. The torn iridescent fabric of the flight suit surrounding the injury was clearly hindering proper care. Dale realized he had to cut it away, but the material was strange. When he touched the oil-slick fabric, it felt icy and subtly energized, giving off a nearly imperceptible resistance. He retrieved his hunting knife, a solid carbon steel blade he'd sharpened daily for decades. He worked meticulously, starting several inches away from the torn edge. The material didn't fray or rip, it sheared cleanly under the pressure, like cutting through stiff metallic foil. As he removed the suit sections, more of the entity's body was revealed. The chest and abdomen were startlingly narrow, the rib cage barely visible beneath the taut, pale skin, implying an internal structure far different from a human's. He noted what appeared to be small, metallic ports or nodes embedded near the hip bone, perfectly flush with the skin, which the suit fabric seemed designed to cover or interact with. He cut away enough material to give him clear access to the deep wound, which now looked shockingly raw and alien against the purity of the surrounding skin. He placed the severed pieces of the suit into a clean cloth and hid them under the bed, knowing that the material itself might be evidence, or perhaps, a key to understanding this creature's immediate needs. The knife felt heavy and inadequate in his hand. 2:45:11 p.m. July 19, 2025. Dale had exhausted the utility of hydrogen peroxide and gauze. The wound needed something stronger, a broad-spectrum antibiotic designed for human consumption, but which was the only recourse he had. He checked his supplies, his prescription refills were low, and he was out of painkillers that might manage shock. The nearest pharmacy was a 7-mile drive into town, a trip he considered suicide. The military, the government, maybe even just local law enforcement, they had to be looking for the source of the flash fire and the boom. Every minute he spent outside the cabin increased the chance of discovery. He needed heavy-duty adhesive tape and a bag of 4-saline solution, if he could even passably explain that purchase. He went to his gun safe and pulled out his old 9mm, holstering it beneath his work shirt. He put on a battered baseball cap to obscure his face further, though he knew the salt and pepper buzz cut was distinctive enough. He had to be quick, anonymous, and absolutely certain no one followed him back down the dirt road. The silence of the cabin felt loud, and the thought of leaving the entity alone, possibly conscious and vulnerable, sent a sickening surge of adrenaline through him. He locked the hidden room door, then the cabin's main door, listening to the heavy bolts slide home. The risk was enormous, but without real medical intervention, the alien was going to die right here, and Dale Kincaid would be left cleaning up the wreckage. 3:15 and 58 seconds p.m. July 19, 2025. The old Ford pickup bounced violently down the rutted track. Dale drove aggressively, maintaining a paranoid watch on his rearview mirror, convinced every shadow was a surveillance drone. He made it to the small, poorly lit general store and pharmacy in North Forks in under 20 minutes. He bypassed the usual items and headed straight for the medical section. He grabbed 3 boxes of the highest-grade antibiotics available without a direct prescription, a handful of industrial-strength medical tape rolls, the kind used for serious sprains, and 2 large bottles of purified water. He tried to act casual at the checkout, placing the items on the conveyor belt alongside a pack of cheap cigarettes. His heart hammering against his ribs. The cashier, a teenage girl boredly scrolling her phone, barely glanced up. "High prices on that med tape, huh, Dale?" she mumbled, scanning the items. "Yeah, got a bad farming accident," he lied instantly, his voice rough. "Heavy equipment." The girl nodded without interest. He paid in cash, counted his change meticulously, and walked quickly out. He didn't dare look back. Getting the supplies was only half the terror. Now he had to make the return trip, ensuring no one, no car, no drone, had registered his presence or his unusual purchases. The world felt smaller, tighter, and infinitely more dangerous now that he was a custodian of secrets. 3:52 and 40 seconds p.m. July 19, 2025. Back at the cabin, Dale secured the truck and dashed inside, the paper bag rustling loudly in his grip. The outer door was secured, the inner hidden door lock was undisturbed. He slid the deadbolt back and pushed the heavy cabinet aside, plunging into the relative darkness of the small back room. He stopped dead in the doorway, the antibiotics sliding out of the bag and hitting the wooden floor. The entity was no longer prone. It was sitting upright against the wall, its back leaning against the rough-hewn planks. The injured leg was still extended, but it was using its left, 3-fingered hand to gently apply pressure to the laceration. Its massive black eyes immediately fixed on Dale, displaying the same unnerving intensity. The shift was subtle, perhaps only a movement of 4 feet, but it was monumental. It indicated consciousness, agency, and a physical strength Dale had not accounted for. The creature hadn't struggled or escaped, but it had repositioned itself, assessing its environment. Dale fought the sudden, overwhelming urge to run and never look back. He slowly bent down, gathering the scattered supplies, demonstrating that he was returning with aid, not malice. The entity remained silent, watching the man's panic and his subsequent attempt at controlled action, processing every variable in the small, humid room. 4:15 and 2 seconds p.m. July 19, 2025. Dale forced himself into action. He needed to establish a routine, a sense of predictable normalcy, for both their sakes. He opened the antibiotics, swallowing one himself first just to prove they weren't poison, then crushed a tablet into a fine powder, mixing it with some of the purified water. He used a fresh strip of cotton to try and clean the area again, applying the powdered antibiotic mixture. The entity tolerated the action, the mechanical hum starting up again, low and consistent. Dale then stabilized the wound using the industrial medical tape, wrapping the slender leg tightly but carefully. It wasn't a doctor's job, but it was better than letting the wound fester. He then realized he had provided nothing for sustenance. He brought a glass of fresh well water and held it out. The entity's long neck bent slightly, but the gaze remained fixed on Dale's face, not the water. Dale set the glass down within reach, then offered a small piece of beef jerky, the most nutrient-dense food he had. The alien ignored the jerky completely, focusing instead on the ceiling fixture. It seemed preoccupied, possibly calculating the structural integrity of the cabin, or perhaps monitoring external signals Dale couldn't detect. Dale backed away, satisfied with the temporary stabilization, but deeply unsettled by the creature's relentless, silent observation. He reinforced the outer barricade before leaving, the paranoia of being trapped inside with a rapidly recovering alien outweighing the fear of leaving the door secured. The cabin air, previously thin with fear and pine dust, felt heavy as Dale Kincaid, 54, heavy-set and breathing hard beneath his salt and pepper buzz cut, re-entered. He was wearing the same faded blue work shirt and suspenders over a white undershirt, his arms loaded with a heavy, sealed plastic jug of water, a moth-eaten woolen blanket, and his aging battery-powered lantern. The light from the lantern, yellow and unstable, chased the deep shadows away just enough to illuminate the cot. The entity, which had been slumped loosely against the piled-up burlap sacks 20 minutes ago, was subtly different. Its 6 feet 5 inches frame was still terrifyingly gaunt, the translucent white skin pulled tight over its bones, showing the faint map of blue veins beneath, but its head had shifted. It was no longer listing to the left, its neck was now held straight, its large, smooth, reflective black eyes fixed directly on the entry point, on Dale. There was no flicker of surprise or panic in those eyes, only intense, cold observation. The torn flight suit of iridescent, oil-slick fabric looked slightly less disheveled, as if the entity had used its 3 elongated fingers to smooth some of the wrinkles while Dale was gone. A low, wet whistling sound, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator, indicated a change in its shallow, ragged breathing pattern. Dale felt the icy shock of recognition. This wasn't just survival instinct, this was conscious, directed recovery. He dropped the supplies with a muffled thud that didn't even make the entity blink. Dale managed to kneel beside the cot, the cheap, rough wool of the blanket chafing against his trousers. He knew water was the most basic necessity for any biological life form. Grabbing a small, clean aluminum measuring cup from his meager kitchen supplies, he dipped into the plastic jug. The water was icy cold, drawn from the well just hours before. The problem was how to administer it. He couldn't simply pour it down its throat, the entity's jaw and specialized mouth structure looked fragile. Deciding on the least invasive method, he retrieved a large, unused livestock syringe, stripped of its needle. He loaded perhaps 5 milliliters of water. As he brought the syringe close, the entity's head remained perfectly still, but its right hand, the one that had been curled near its waist, unfurled. Those 3 elongated fingers, tipped with what looked like polished obsidian rather than nails, trembled slightly. Dale watched the delicate skin around the knuckles stretch, revealing the underlying structures. He gently nudged the syringe tip against the alien's lower lip, a feature barely distinguishable from the rest of its facial structure. A muscle beneath the cheekbone twitched, and the lips parted almost imperceptibly. Dale slowly depressed the plunger. The water disappeared instantly, absorbed, not swallowed, with no visible gag reflex. It was a terrifyingly efficient process, confirming that even basic consumption was utterly different from human physiology. Dale reloaded the syringe, a heavy sweat beginning to form on his brow despite the cool mountain air. The hydration attempt continued, molecule by molecule, until perhaps a cup of water had been administered. Dale paused, setting the syringe down on a stack of grimy field manuals. He picked up the lantern and held it closer to the deep, ragged tear in the alien's thigh, the worst of the wounds, where the iridescent flight suit was shredded and the pale, translucent flesh was marbled with black, coagulated residue. As the lantern light played across the entity's large, smooth black eyes, Dale saw something unsettling. The reflection was impossibly clear. The small, dirty details of his cabin, the dust motes floating in the air, the crack in the ceiling beam, the faint date stamp in the upper corner of the imaginary VHS frame, were captured perfectly, geometrically precise, in those pools of blackness. It wasn't just seeing, it was high-definition spatial mapping. Dale realized the entity wasn't suffering in silence, it was compiling data about its immediate surroundings, perhaps cataloging threat vectors or escape routes. The fear ratcheted up again. This thing wasn't just a wounded animal, it was an intelligence far surpassing his own, currently trapped in a failing biological shell. He picked up a clean, boiled strip of sheeting and began trying to gently wipe away the crusting residue from the wound's edge. The entity did not flinch, but the blue veins visible beneath the skin pulsed with a noticeable increase in speed near the injury site. Feeling the overwhelming need to establish some form of cooperative rapport, even if futile, Dale leaned in. His voice was a rasp, unused to anything but the occasional shout at his dogs. "Can you understand me?" "Me. Dale." He pointed a thick, calloused finger at his chest, then back at the entity. "You. Wounded. Safe." He kept his words painfully simple, the kind of halting language one might use with a very young child or a pet. The entity's breathing slowed, the wet whistle diminishing until there was almost silence, save for the crackle of the lantern wick. The black eyes remained locked on his face, moving slightly to track the motions of his lips. Then, a reaction. Not a sound, but a physiological change in its throat. A faint, internal clicking noise, like polished stones shifting, resonated deep within its chest cavity, audible only because Dale was so close. The elongated fingers on its left hand curled tighter, demonstrating tension, not distress. It wasn't confusion, it was processing. Dale tried another word, home. He mimed a helicopter motion, pointing skyward, then back to the entity. The entity held his gaze for a long moment, the strange clicking stopping. Then, very slowly, a minuscule muscle near its left eye twitched, a negative shake, a universal sign of negation that transcended language, or perhaps just a localized spasm. Either way, the message Dale received was clear: it wasn't going home anytime soon. While moving the woolen blanket to better insulate the entity from the cold floorboards, Dale's hand brushed against a small piece of debris that had been embedded in the tattered remnants of the iridescent flight suit. It was jagged and dark, clearly part of the wreck, but unlike the fused, melted metal fragments, this item felt strangely warm and yielding, almost like very dense cartilage. It was roughly the size of a cigarette pack, curved gently, and seemed to be biointegrated. It had pulled away from the suit rather than simply falling off. As Dale carefully picked it up using the corner of the blanket, a flicker of light emanated from within the object itself, the exact, faint, ethereal blue visible in the entity's veins. It pulsed 3 times in quick succession, coinciding with the accelerated beating of the entity's own heart, visible now as a rapid ripple beneath the translucent skin of its upper chest. The object began to emit an almost inaudible, high-frequency hum that vibrated the wool blanket. Dale recognized it immediately. This was a power source, a communicator, or perhaps a medical device, and it was intrinsically linked to the entity's survival. Fear warred with curiosity. If he pulled it away, would he kill it? If he left it there, could it transmit its location? He held the strange device suspended an inch above the wooden floor, watching the blue light synchronize with the biological pulse of the alien. The dilemma of the humming blue device was suddenly resolved for Dale. He had started to examine the torn edges of the flight suit near the entity's shoulder, intending to use the clean sheeting to staunch some lingering internal fluid leakage. The suit fabric, feeling like cool, oily silk, snagged slightly on his rough fingertips. As he applied the slightest pressure to the underlying wound, attempting to assess its depth, the entity moved with shocking speed and strength. Without warning, its right hand, the one with the 3 elongated fingers, snapped out and closed around Dale's wrist. The grip was instantaneous, silent, and incredibly cold, the temperature shock registering through the thin fabric of Dale's undershirt. Dale gasped, not from pain, but from the sheer, sudden force. The entity had gone from near-death fragility to commanding physical power in an instant. Its black eyes, inches from Dale's face, were no longer passive observers, they were intense, warning beacons. The grip was not crushing, but immovable, a clear communication: do not touch. This was the first indisputable evidence of conscious, directed physical ability. Dale froze, every muscle tight, the fear cementing itself into a cold, paralyzing dread. He could feel the fine, crystalline structure of the alien's digits pressed against his radial pulse. The entity held the grip for perhaps 5 agonizing seconds before slowly, deliberately, relaxing its fingers, withdrawing its hand back to its side. The action punctuated by a single, sharp exhale that sounded like dry leaves scraping pavement. The feeling of that sudden, focused exertion from the entity, the way the 3 elongated fingers tightened on the slick, torn fabric of its suit, had snapped Dale back. He hadn't been hurt, but it was a clear sign: stay away from the humming artifact. Dale stepped back a half pace, his heavy work boots crunching gravel, raising a plume of dust visible in the flashlight's beam. He held the water canteen defensively, his salt and pepper buzz cut catching the weak light. He saw the entity's large, smooth, reflective black eyes track his movement with alarming speed. Despite its overall stillness and fragility, those eyes conveyed total awareness. The artifact itself was unsettling. It wasn't metal, or at least, not metal Dale recognized. It looked like petrified wood or dense obsidian, about the size of a large pocket watch, embedded directly into the shredded composite material of the wreck, almost like a massive, complex cyst. The low-frequency hum vibrated the air around it. Dale leaned in, ignoring the entity's silent plea. He noticed faint, almost microscopic tendrils of the artifact seemed to be fused directly into the wreck's infrastructure. It wasn't an accessory, it was organically integrated into the ship's remains. Dale lifted his left hand, the thumb and forefinger hovering inches away, debating whether to risk touching it again. He could feel the pulse of the hum in the bone of his fingertips. The image flickered on the monitor. The timestamp read, July 19, 2025, 4:17 and 44 seconds. Curiosity, or maybe just the stubbornness ingrained from 54 years of rural life, won out. Dale cautiously extended a finger, pushing aside a strip of the oil-slick iridescent fabric of the alien's torn flight suit, and lightly pressed the dome of the humming device. The moment his skin made contact, the vibration intensified sharply, resonating up his arm and into his chest, a deep, unnerving bass note that felt more physical than audible. Simultaneously, the low-fidelity video feed from the camcorder suffered a violent jolt of static, the screen tearing horizontally for a split second before stabilizing. It was interference, analog feedback from the pulsing energy. Dale yanked his finger back, breathing heavily. He looked at the entity. Its head was slightly raised off the makeshift pillow of old blankets. The translucent white skin of its face seemed taut, and the faint blue veins tracing paths beneath its surface were momentarily darker, more prominent, like tributaries filling with sudden pressure. The reflective black eyes were no longer just observant, they were pleading, focused entirely on the device, then back to Dale, clearly conveying urgency. This wasn't pain, this was dependence. It needed that hum. Dale wiped his sweaty palms on his faded blue work shirt. He understood that whatever this object was, it was actively doing something vital, and his touch was disrupting it. Dale lowered the canteen and tried a different tactic, one based on observation rather than interference. "Listen," he muttered, his voice gravelly, adjusting his suspenders. "I don't know what you need, but if I touch that, the damn camera nearly quits, and you get jumpy." He pointed at the device, then pointed to himself. "Dale." He paused, hoping for a repeat of the failed vocal mimicry, but received only silence. Then, the entity moved. It was a slow, deliberate movement, conserving every shred of its limited energy. The 3 elongated fingers of its left hand rose slightly. First, they traced a specific, complex pattern on the dome of the humming artifact, a slow, circling gesture, almost like activating a lock. Then, the fingers moved away, landing gently on the entity's own ribcage, right over the area where the worst of the suit damage had exposed the delicate, pale flesh. The gesture was unmistakable: device first, then injury. Communication had finally broken through the language barrier, delivered in the simplest form, a directive concerning self-preservation. It was telling him to stabilize the device, which, in turn, stabilized itself. Dale realized he had treated the artifact as a risk, when perhaps it was the equivalent of a pacemaker, keeping the injured, biological humanoid functioning. The dilemma was immediate. If the device was a stabilizer, why was it causing such intense feedback and draining energy? Dale looked closely at the torn edges where the device was biointegrated into the ship's wreckage. He saw tiny, barely perceptible trails of white smoke, not heat vapor, but something more like supercooled air escaping. Whatever power source the entity was using, it was leaking catastrophically through the broken connection points near the device. The hum was becoming ragged, slightly erratic. If it was draining the last vestiges of internal power, leaving it connected might be the cause of its eventual failure, not its salvation. Dale made a decision driven by necessity and his innate mechanical background. He needed to isolate the device, or at least sever its link to the primary, ruined power cell of the wreck. He pulled a worn folding utility knife from the pocket of his faded blue work shirt, opening the heavy blade with a solid click. He knelt beside the wreck, ignoring the intense, silent scrutiny of the alien's black eyes. The translucent skin shimmered slightly in alarm. "Hold on, pal," Dale murmured, focused on the task. He carefully inserted the tip of the blade into the brittle composite material surrounding the artifact, aiming to sever the microscopic, fused tendrils that linked it to the broader wreckage, hoping to turn it into a self-contained unit. The composite was surprisingly fibrous and resistant, but Dale's strength, honed by years of manual labor, was enough. With a final, sickening grinding sound, the connections were severed. The intense, ragged humming stopped instantly. The silence was absolute, heavier than the sound had been. The entity's reaction was immediate and terrifying. It didn't cry out, it was still incapable of vocalizing, but its slender, 6 feet 5 inches body seized up in a brief, agonizing spasm. The color drained from its translucent skin until it was nearly bone white, and then, just as rapidly, the network of faint blue veins beneath the skin flared, turning brilliant cerulean, pulsing visibly across its chest and limbs. Its large, black eyes went wide with what could only be described as stark, primal terror and physical distress. It was experiencing profound system shock. Dale, horrified by the immediate consequence of his action, instinctively reached out, but stopped himself, realizing his intervention had been disastrously wrong. The device wasn't a drain, it was a localized field generator, necessary for stabilizing the alien's internal biology. The alien began trembling violently, its 3-fingered hands clenching into useless, tight fists against the scorched earth. Desperation fueled a surge of activity Dale hadn't witnessed before. The entity, rallying all its remaining conscious energy, focused its gaze not on Dale, but on the space directly above the severed device. With an enormous, visible effort that seemed to exhaust the very oxygen from its lungs, a sudden burst of pure, chaotic energy erupted. It wasn't light, but a physical projection, a sensory, non-vocal blast. Dale felt a crushing pressure in his sinuses and heard a deafening shriek that wasn't actually audible, but felt transmitted directly into the inner ear. The VHS camera went completely haywire, the timestamp vanished, replaced by solid, flickering green bars and a roar of white noise. For one terrifying, extended second, Dale saw it, not a picture, but a feeling of absolute cold, a vast, star-peppered blackness, and then a brief, searing flash of impossible heat, a massive, geometric structure shattering into a million pieces. The image was gone instantly, replaced by the shaky, grainy feed of the camcorder, pointed at the pale, trembling alien. The entity was slumped back down, every muscle exhausted, its breathing now shallow and ragged, the brilliant blue Venus flare receding slightly, leaving it ghostly white once more. It had burned its last reserves to transmit a fraction of its memory. Disaster. Dale was reeling, his head throbbing from the silent sensory assault. He gripped the edge of the wreckage to steady himself. That brief, visceral flash was undeniable evidence. This being wasn't just stranded, it was fleeing an annihilation event. The sheer scale of the terror conveyed in that second was overwhelming. He looked down at the humming device, now silent and inert in his hand, detached from its power source. It wasn't a simple communicator, or even just a stabilizer, it was a crucial buffer, managing the severe trauma and perhaps regulating the entity's unique biology in Earth's hostile atmosphere. By isolating it, he had inadvertently severed its connection to its final trickle of internal power. His crude attempts to fix the leakage had almost killed the biological humanoid. He knew, with sudden, absolute clarity, that he had less than an hour, maybe less, before the entity's fragile system failed completely. He had to reconnect the device somehow, even if it meant risking the entire area blowing up from the leaking energy. His eyes scanned the small bag of tools and supplies he'd brought back: duct tape, a multi-tool, a spare battery for the flashlight. He needed a way to provide power to this severed life support node, and he needed it now. The auditory silence that followed the psychic burst was the worst sound Dale had ever heard. The air in the barn now smelled metallic and profoundly cold, like ozone mixed with old blood. Dale, still leaning against the stall door, shaking off the residual disorientation, watched the alien thrash. Its long, slender limbs jerked violently, but weakly, against the makeshift restraints. The translucent white skin, previously merely pallid, was now taking on a dreadful, mottled gray hue, spreading from the center of its chest outward. Dale's breath hitched. He realized that the brief, catastrophic projection hadn't been a desperate communication, it had been a terminal symptom. Removing the device hadn't stopped an energy drain, it had severed a vital regulatory circuit. He could see the faint blue veins beneath the graying skin flickering erratically, like a fuse box short-circuiting. The timestamp in the corner of the feed began to strobe wildly between 23 hours 45 minutes and 1 second and ERR_SYNCH, adding a jarring visual discord to the panic. The alien let out a thin, sustained noise, high-pitched and completely unlike its previous low moans, a sound that Dale instinctively knew was the last cry of a dying thing. He had seconds. Dale scrambled across the dirt floor, his heavy boots kicking up dust that caught the weak light of the single bulb. His salt and pepper buzz cut was damp with sweat. He grabbed the bio-integrated humming device where he had dropped it. It felt disconcertingly warm and pulsed gently, almost independently, in his hand. He looked down at the alien. The large, smooth black eyes, which had held such intelligence and suffering moments before, were now glazed over, losing their reflective quality. He remembered the precise, organic way the device had integrated with the wrist socket. This wasn't a battery pack or a radio, this was a transplanted organ. "Damn fool, Dale," he muttered, shoving his faded blue shirt sleeve up and wiping his brow with the back of his heavy hand. "You think everything runs on AAA batteries and copper wire." The device continued its rhythmic, low-frequency thrumming, seemingly pleading for reconnection. The gravity of the situation slammed into him. If he hesitated, he wouldn't just be dealing with a wounded visitor, he'd be dealing with a cadaver of interstellar proportions, and the resulting contamination issues terrified him far more than any energy bill. The metallic smell intensified as Dale braced himself. Reconnecting the technology felt like crossing a line he had consciously avoided. Up until now, his actions had been based on simple first aid: clean, bind, rest. Plugging this biological machine back into the patient meant embracing the fact that this creature operated on physics he didn't comprehend. He lifted the alien's impossibly long arm. The iridescent, oil-slick fabric of the torn flight suit caught the barn light unevenly, shimmering green and purple. The socket on the wrist, previously a deep crimson where the organic tissue met the technology, was now tight, pale, and gray. Dale held the humming device, aligning the slightly sticky, biopolymer connection points with the receiving groove. His hand shook slightly, causing the timestamp overlay, now flickered back to 23 hours 46 minutes and 12 seconds, to jump momentarily. He had to be quick and precise. Any damage to the interface might be irreversible. He pushed. The moment the connection was made, there was no click or electronic hum. Instead, it was a sound Dale could only describe as wet, a sickening, vascular, slurping noise, followed immediately by a profound physical reaction. The alien's body arched sharply, pulling against the ropes, but this time not in pain, but in forced regeneration. The device itself began to glow with a dull, emerald light that pulsed in sync with its internal thrum. This light transmitted directly into the translucent skin of the alien's arm. The gray pallor vanished almost instantly, replaced by the faint, healthy white, and the visible blue veins surged with intense, bright azure light, appearing like tiny, lightning-fast rivers beneath the surface. The alien released the high, sustained whine and replaced it with a deep, shuddering intake of breath. The air temperature in the barn seemed to normalize instantly, dissipating the chilling metallic scent. Dale stumbled back, utterly exhausted by the sudden, violent shift in the room's atmosphere, watching the intense blue current course through the creature he had nearly killed. Stabilized, the alien lay still for nearly 5 full minutes, the rhythmic pulse of the device the only sound besides Dale's heavy breathing. The intense azure light in the veins gradually subsided to a steady, soft glow. Then, the large black eyes blinked slowly, focusing entirely on Dale. There was no menace, only a desperate urgency that transcended language. The device, still pulsing, shifted its internal rhythm. Instead of the steady, thrum dash, it began emitting short, staccato bursts, like Morse code filtered through water. This auditory change was accompanied by a focused beam of pale green light originating from the center of the device, projecting onto the rough, dusty wood wall directly opposite Dale. The light was highly directional, painting a complex, moving geometric pattern that defied terrestrial understanding. Dale squinted, trying to make sense of the dizzying, constantly shifting angles and lines. It was a projection, a conscious attempt at communication, far more sophisticated and intentional than the distress blast. Dale, who hadn't moved from his defensive crouch, watched the projection intently. The geometric shapes suddenly coalesced. The dizzying lines snapped into a simple diagram: first, an outline of the field outside the barn; second, a crude but unmistakable drawing of the crater where the wreckage lay; and finally, a specific location within the wreckage, highlighted by a violently pulsing red overlay. The image dissolved and reformed, displaying a distinct, three-pronged object, shaped like a tuning fork but terminating in spherical nodes. The message was clear, overriding any verbal communication: go there. Get this, the urgency radiating off the alien was palpable. Its recovery was contingent on this retrieval. Dale understood this wasn't an optional request, it was a directive born of catastrophe. He pushed himself to his feet, the suspenders taut against his shoulders, his worn blue shirt clinging to his heavy frame. A component, Dale grunted, speaking more to himself than the alien. You need me to get something from the wreck, right now. The clock displayed 9 minutes and 55 seconds. Dale looked out the small, dusty window of the barn. The moon was high, making the field outside a mosaic of deep shadow and weak silver light. He couldn't wait until morning. The desperation in the alien's large black eyes confirmed the immediate necessity. He quickly moved to the back wall where his tools hung. He grabbed a heavy-duty, rechargeable flashlight, noting with displeasure that the battery indicator was already blinking yellow, a persistent issue with the old unit. He also secured his crowbar, its rusty shaft a familiar weight in his hand, and strapped a worn leather sheath containing his hunting knife to his belt. This trip was different. The first time, he was driven by curiosity and fear of the unknown. Now, he was responding to a critical directive from a conscious, intelligent being whose life he was responsible for maintaining. He stopped beside the alien one last time, meeting its gaze. "All right," Dale said, his voice low and firm. "Don't you go dying on me while I'm out there. You got that?" He took a deep breath, adjusted his white undershirt beneath his work shirt, and pushed open the heavy wooden door leading into the cold rural night. The humid night air hit Dale, sharp and cool after the enclosed warmth of the barn. He clicked on the flashlight. The beam was weak, tunneling through the darkness rather than illuminating it. The journey through the thick, dewy hay field was slow and cumbersome. Every step was a commitment, his boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. The silence of the night was only broken by the distant, cyclical call of a whippoorwill and the steady crunch of his own movement. He kept glancing back at the dim outline of the barn, an anchor point in the oppressive blackness. He knew what awaited him: twisted metal, strange biomatter, and now, the specific task of retrieving a critical, foreign component under duress. The whole situation felt like a ridiculous, high-stakes scavenger hunt that only existed on low-quality VHS tape. He could feel the fine, damp condensation settling on his exposed arms and the thinning salt and pepper hair of his buzzcut. The further he walked from the safety of the barn, the more exposed and isolated he felt, an insignificant figure moving through the vast, unknowable dark towards impossible technology. The small, flickering light projection, the one that had displayed the impossible schematic, vanished, leaving the cabin steeped in the low-light bleed of the oil lamp. Dale stood, his heavy breath visible in the chilly air, the image of the component burned into his retinas, a silver-black cylinder attached near a structural joint, partially buried. The alien lay absolutely still, the faint hum from the reconnected device the only proof of its continued existence. 9 miles, Dale muttered, pulling his suspenders tighter over his white undershirt. His hands were shaking, less from exhaustion and more from the sheer, terrifying necessity of the task. He grabbed his largest adjustable wrench and a faded canvas mail carrier bag, the one he used for hauling heavy tools. As he moved toward the door, the alien's head slowly turned, the massive black eyes tracking him. There was no telepathy now, just pure, desperate visual communication. Dale felt the weight of that silent plea settle on his broad shoulders. "I see it. I got it," he grunted, checking the lock on the cabin door. He had to assume the military surveillance was still passive or had lost him in the deep woods, but returning to the site of impact felt like walking back into a hunter's trap. He slammed the door shut behind him. The timestamp glitched, then stabilized. September 17, 2025, 1:38 and 15 seconds. The old four-wheeler roared to life, the sound swallowed immediately by the dense Maine woods. The camera, mounted precariously on the ATV's rack, captured a dizzying sequence of jarring bumps and low-hanging branches snapping past the lens. Dale drove with reckless abandon, guided only by the faint deer path he'd widened over the years, now lit weakly by the ATV's failing headlamp. The air was cold, crisp, and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. Every bounce jarred his teeth, and he swore loudly whenever a pothole threatened to overturn the heavy machine. He kept checking the timestamp. The alien had implied immediate retrieval. Every minute lost felt like a nail in the coffin of the fragile being back in his cabin. He knew the component was vital, the linchpin to its survival, yet his brain struggled to reconcile the immense technological complexity with the desperate simplicity of his current role, a glorified scavenger. The terrain worsened, the trail turning into slick mud near the creek bed, forcing him to slow down and use all his strength to wrestle the machine forward. He glanced down at the canvas bag containing the wrench, feeling the strange mixture of adrenaline and bone-deep fatigue. The low-fidelity tracking on the recording slipped severely, creating a momentary band of static noise before the image snapped back into grainy focus. September 17, 2025, 1:54:49 seconds. He finally slowed the ATV, cutting the engine about a quarter mile from the crash site to avoid attracting attention with the noise. The silence that followed was immense, heavy, broken only by his own labored breathing. He dismounted, grabbing the bag. As he walked the last stretch, the air grew noticeably warmer, thick with the stench of ozone, burnt synthetic compounds, and pulverized rock. Even in the profound darkness, the physical scar on the landscape was overwhelming. The sheer force of the impact had flattened decades of growth. A faint, unsettling glow emanated from the core of the wreckage field, a strange blue-green luminescence deep within the fractured mass of alien alloys. Dale remembered the schematic, orienting himself based on the major structural ridge that jutted out like a broken wing. He had to trespass deep into the wreckage zone, a place that felt biologically hostile to him. The camera's autogain struggled with the strange light sources, making the video overexposed and sickly pale in patches, yet intensely dark in the shadows cast by the debris. September 17, 2025, 2:08:01 seconds. The ground underfoot was a treacherous mix of jagged earth and sharp, twisted pieces of metallic foil. Dale navigated carefully, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the detritus. He reached the specified area, a zone where the iridescent, oil-slick flight suit fabric seemed to have fused permanently with the superstructure. The schematics had shown the component resting near the base of the primary stabilizing strut. He used the flashlight app on his worn flip phone, casting a narrow, unstable beam that illuminated the specific spot. There it was, a perfect cylinder, perhaps 2 feet long and 6 inches in diameter, partially embedded in the alien shell. It wasn't metal as Dale understood it, the surface was perfectly smooth, obsidian black, and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A low, rhythmic pulse was almost audible when he pressed his ear near it. The retrieval instructions had been simple: remove the housing plate and disconnect the primary feed. Dale saw the alien tech equivalent of thick bolts, 4 shimmering nodes that held the plate in place. He hoped his wrench would be enough to break the seal. He realized the cylinder was likely part of a complex energy regulation or short-term containment system. September 17, 2025, 2:16:34 seconds. Dale positioned the wrench on the largest node. The alien alloy was unervingly resilient. He strained, his suspenders cutting into his shoulders, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. The wrench slipped with a painful metallic shriek that echoed disturbingly across the silent destruction field. He repositioned, applying all 250 pounds of his body weight and force. With a loud, grinding snap that felt more like a decompression than a break, the first node gave way. He fought through the second and third, the rhythmic sound of the pulse from the component intensifying slightly with each disruption. As he wrestled with the final node, a sudden, rustling noise erupted nearby, sounding large and fast. Dale froze, flashlight beam darting into the woods. It was likely just a frightened deer or a nocturnal predator, but the isolation and the strangeness of the location amplified his paranoia. He gritted his teeth, yanked the wrench one last time, and the final node severed. He quickly dislodged the component. It was heavy, strangely cold to the touch, and now humming with a distinct, electrical frequency. Dale dropped it carefully into the canvas bag. Mission objective secured. September 17, 2025, 2:22:11. The moment the cylindrical component was secured, Dale's anxiety shifted entirely to the journey back. The canvas bag felt like a lead weight dragging on his shoulder, and the insistent hum emanating from inside was loud enough to make the hair stand up on his arms. He broke into a stumbling run, ignoring the sharp edges of the debris field. He reached the ATV, threw the bag onto the rack, and kicked the engine to life, not caring about the noise now. Time was the only enemy. He drove even faster on the return trip, accepting the violent, jarring motion of the ATV over the rough trail. The camera shook violently, the image blurring into streaks of light and dark. He kept seeing the image of the alien's eyes, the faint blue veins pressing against the translucent skin. He knew if the life support hum had stopped back at the cabin, his efforts would be meaningless. He felt a sudden, powerful surge of possessiveness and fear for the strange, broken creature he was housing. He took a corner too fast, nearly flipping the ATV, but managed to right it with a desperate surge of muscle, his heart hammering against his ribs. The tracking was failing badly, the timestamp repeatedly corrupted into gibberish before resolving back to the current time. September 17, 2025, 2:37:55. Dale burst through the cabin door, the canvas bag hitting the floor with a heavy thud that rattled the glassware. The lamp flickered violently. He stood panting, leaning against the doorframe, trying to regain control of his breathing. The air in the cabin felt colder than when he left. He rushed to the makeshift bed. The alien was frighteningly still. Its chest rose and fell almost imperceptibly, and the low, stabilizing hum from the small device was painfully weak, strained. The faint blue veins were far more prominent now, like intricate, painful rivers flowing beneath the paper-white skin. Dale quickly pulled the heavy, humming component out of the canvas bag and slid it across the floor toward the bed. The alien, sensing the object, lifted its large, smooth head slightly. Its 3 elongated fingers reached out, trembling, and gently touched the obsidian cylinder. The moment contact was made, the cylinder's internal humming abruptly changed pitch, rising sharply, then settling into a steady, resonant thrum. The small, primary life support device also reacted, its light pulsing immediately brighter. The alien closed its eyes, and a palpable wave of relaxation seemed to wash over its slender frame. Dale watched, utterly drained, realizing his dangerous midnight errand had bought them a little more time. September 17, 2025, 2:45:03. 3:14:01 Eastern Standard Time. The barn door creaks shut behind Dale, the sound a ragged echo in the cavernous space. He stumbles 2 steps, the mud caked heavy on his worn boots. His chest heaves, visible even through the low-fidelity camera's grainy static, the damp spots darkening the white undershirt beneath his faded blue work shirt and suspenders. Clutched tightly against his torso is the cylindrical component, heavy, cold, and strangely seamless. He drops it with a muffled thud onto the hay-strewn floor next to the alien. The immediate sight of Vex jolts the exhaustion from him. The translucent skin, usually milky white with visible blue veins, has taken on a frightening, ash-gray pallor, particularly around the chest wound. The large black eyes are unfocused, flickering only marginally when Dale kneels beside the stabilizing unit, ESU, attached to the alien's torso. Vex weakly lifts a 3-fingered hand, pointing briefly at the pulsing schematic still projected on the floor. The slot where the component must be housed is flashing a harsh, distorted red. Dale rips off his sweat-dampened undershirt, using it to quickly wipe the mud and debris from the component, his hands shaking so violently the cylinder nearly slips from his grasp, forcing a low, desperate grunt from the heavy-set man. 3:19:35 Eastern Standard Time. Dale positions the component over the receptor slot on the ESU, guided by the flickering blue lines of the projected schematic. The component is heavy, and the connection point is surprisingly intricate, a series of tiny, almost invisible locking tabs that require precise alignment and firm, steady pressure. Dale's large, calloused fingers, adept at handling farm equipment and repair, are agonizingly clumsy for this delicate work. The grainy footage shows the sweat dripping from his forehead onto the iridescent fabric of Vex's flight suit. He tries the insertion once, misaligning the tabs, and the component grates against the metal housing. A faint, low electronic whine issues from the ESU, sounding like a dying battery. Vex lets out a painful, involuntary hiss, the sound compressed and distorted by the VHS microphone, making it sound more like tearing cloth than a biological noise. Dale pulls back instantly, his breath catching in his throat. He forces himself to look at the schematic again, the diagrams blurring slightly with his mounting anxiety. He realizes the component must be rotated nearly 90 degrees counterclockwise before seating. The pressure of time, the alien's diminishing vitality, and his own physical exhaustion are a crushing weight. 3:22 and 11 seconds Eastern Standard Time, Dale carefully rotates the cylinder, aligning the minute locking tabs. Just as he starts to press the component home, Vex's body snaps taut in a sudden, horrific spasm. The large, black eyes roll back momentarily, showing only the sickly white membrane underneath. A high-frequency, grating sound, pure distress, cuts through the barn air, causing the camera's audio level indicator to peak and distort the sound aggressively. The violent movement jars the ESU, and the schematic projection on the floor flickers out entirely, plunging the immediate area into near darkness, illuminated only by the faint, failing light of the remaining barn bulb. The component slips from Dale's grasp and clatters hard against the stone floor, narrowly missing Vex's head. Dale cries out, a strangled sound of panic and terror, and scrambles to retrieve the cylinder, his heart hammering against his ribs. He is acutely aware that he may have just failed, and the consequence is irreversible. He leans over the alien, using his heavy body to gently steady the convulsing figure, whispering reassurances that sound hollow even to his own ears. 3:25 and 49 seconds Eastern Standard Time. The seizure passes, leaving Vex limp and terrifyingly still, the gray coloration spreading further across the skin. Dale knows he has less than a minute. Ignoring the pain in his knees and the throbbing in his temples, he picks up the component. He uses the rigid edge of a rusty hay hook found nearby to help stabilize his shaking wrist. He breathes in deeply, focusing entirely on the three faint, almost invisible lines Vex had managed to project onto the cylinder's housing before the power surge. One chance, he pushes, angling the component slightly to the side, and then forward. There is a resistance, then a grinding sound, and finally, a distinct, deeply satisfying metallic click. The cylindrical component is seated. Immediately, the harsh red warning light on the ESU vanishes, replaced by a steady, soothing pale blue pulse. A soft, constant, low-frequency hum fills the barn, a sound of successful energy channeling. The iridescent fabric of Vex's flight suit, which had dulled, catches the light again, shimmering faintly. Dale watches, paralyzed, as the gray pallor on Vex's skin seems to halt, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, begin to recede, returning the skin to its translucent, veined white. 3:30 and 4 seconds Eastern Standard Time, Vex is stabilized. The pulsing light maintains its slow, powerful rhythm. The heavy-set man remains kneeling for a long minute, just watching the steady blue light, listening to the hum. He feels the tension drain out of him not as a release, but as a total collapse of energy. He gently touches Vex's shoulder, the skin is still cold, but the alarming clamminess is gone. Vex is unconscious, resting, finally out of immediate danger. Dale struggles to stand, his joints aching and protesting, the effort nearly too much for his 54-year-old body. He manages to shuffle backward 3 steps until he reaches a sturdy wooden feed bin, against which he slowly slumps down, resting his head on his raised knees. The camera view is low and shaky, focused on the humming ESU and Vex's inert form. For the next hour, only the sounds of Dale's ragged breathing and the steady electronic hum break the silence. He has saved a life, committing himself irrevocably to a secret that could destroy his own, and the sheer magnitude of the decision hits him now, in the quiet aftermath, like a physical blow. 6:41 and 59 seconds Eastern Standard Time. Morning light filters weakly through the cracks in the old barn siding, creating dusty beams that cut through the low-fidelity footage. Dale is still sitting by the feed bin. He hasn't slept, only monitored. He watches the sunlight hit Vex's face, outlining the sharp cheekbones and the unusual reflectivity of the closed black eyes. He hasn't eaten, hasn't dared leave Vex alone. The isolation is starting to twist his perception. Every distant sound, the chirping of a field bird, the faint rumble of a passing diesel engine on the highway miles away, sounds amplified, threatening. He feels an intense, almost physical separation from the normal world outside the barn doors. He reaches for the camera, angling it slightly to show the perimeter of the barn, scrutinizing the shadows, convinced that the stabilization hum might somehow be audible outside. He whispers, his voice dry and scratchy, a low monologue directed perhaps more toward the lens than Vex. Gotta figure out the power drain. This thing won't hold forever. They'll find the signature if I can't hide it. 7:12 and 5 seconds Eastern Standard Time. Driven by newfound paranoia, Dale rises stiffly. He moves toward the corner where he stored the debris from the crash site, a handful of melted, twisted black metal, and a larger, oddly crystalline shard. He picks up the metal, which feels unnaturally cold, even in the morning air. He moves slowly, deliberately, around the main barn doors, stacking up old equipment, a rusty cultivator blade, 3 heavy sacks of unused concrete mix, and a broken hay baler wheel, to further barricade the entrance. The scraping sounds of the metal against the wood are loud and grating. He is building a fortress of rust and decay, an attempt to hold the outside world at bay. The realization dawns on him: the immediate danger of Vex dying is past, but the permanent, underlying threat of discovery, exposure, and the subsequent ruin of his life has only intensified. The camera shakes slightly as he places the last, heavy object, obscuring the door entirely. The isolation is complete. He glances back at the steady blue pulse, confirming Vex is still stable, and accepts the weight of his new reality. Static interference. The cylindrical component, now locked firmly into the crystalline socket of the stabilization unit, emitted a low, resonant, almost musical hum. The sickly green pulse that had been rapidly failing now settled into a steady, reassuring sapphire blue. Dale didn't register the color change immediately, he just registered the cessation of the frantic, desperate flashing. The sheer physical and emotional weight of the last 3 hours, the terrifying drive, the digging, the spasm, the precision installation in the dark, hit him like a cinder block. His heavy frame slumped against the damp dirt floor, arms spread out, panting raggedly, the metallic tang of fear and adrenaline receding from his mouth. He looked up at Vex, whose long, slender body was finally still. The translucent skin, though still pale, was no longer shimmering with internal distress. Vex's large, reflective black eyes were closed. Dale watched the slow, shallow movement of the alien's chest under the ripped, iridescent flight suit. He was alive. Dale had saved him. The monumental secrecy of his actions choked him. He had crossed a boundary no human should ever cross, not for country, nor creed, but for a silent, dying creature from the stars. He pushed himself onto his side, noticing the faint, persistent timestamp blinking in the corner of his vision. August 17, 2025 3:41 and 9 seconds AM. 3:40 in the morning. He needed coffee, he needed a shower, and he needed about a week of sleep, but mostly, he needed to stop being an accessory to an interstellar incident. He just lay there, listening to the humming ESU and the distant chirping of crickets, too drained to move. The darkness in the barn remained oppressive, punctuated only by the ESU's soft blue light. Dale woke suddenly, not by noise, but by a chilling coldness settling over his mind, a sharp, clear presence cutting through the exhaustion. Vex's eyes were open, the depthless black surfaces reflecting the blue hum of the unit. There was no visible movement, no sound from Vex's throat, but the thought projected into Dale's consciousness was unmistakable, sharp as glass: stabilization successful. Gratitude is irrelevant now. The window is closing. Dale pushed himself up, rubbing the stiffness from his 54-year-old knees. You hear me?" he whispered, his voice dry and hoarse. The mental contact intensified, not a voice, but an urgent instruction, overlaid with complex, rapidly shifting geometrical patterns that somehow conveyed technical diagrams. Vex was showing him the next requirement. The retrieval unit needed power for a directional pulse, a signal capable of piercing the planetary interference and reaching their pre-established coordinates. The amount of power required was immense, far more than the depleted internal battery could manage. Local source needed. Immediate. The urgency transmitted was almost physical, tightening Dale's chest. The stabilization component Dale risked his life for was merely step one. The final, most dangerous act of defiance against discovery was about to begin. Vex's eyelids drooped slightly, indicating the effort needed just to communicate this critical information. Dale staggered out of the barn for a few precious minutes, needing air that didn't smell like damp earth and ozone. The world outside the metal sheeting felt alien, hostile. It was approaching dawn, the horizon just starting to leak a bruised purple light. The timestamp flickered, August 17, 2025 4:12 and 35 seconds AM, He saw his old Ford parked near the fence line, mundane and covered in dust, a solid piece of the life he was irrevocably losing. He imagined a sheriff's cruiser pulling up, the blinding spotlights catching him standing next to a barn housing an extraterrestrial traveler. The isolation of his rural Indiana property was his greatest asset, but it also meant he was entirely alone if things went wrong. He walked toward the pump house, the source of all his property's power, trying to ground himself. He remembered the diagram Vex had projected. They needed a massive, short-duration power draw, enough to activate the long-range signal generator. That meant bypassing the breaker box entirely and running a direct feed into the barn, a dangerous, fire-risk level of modification. He realized Vex wasn't just stranded. Vex was utilizing him, leveraging Dale's moral compass and resourcefulness to achieve a critical extraction. This was no longer charity, this was operational necessity. He looked back at the barn, a silent promise of catastrophic discovery hanging in the morning air, and knew he had to finish what he started, or face the consequences of Vex dying and the government finding the wreckage on his land. Returning to the barn, Dale found Vex marginally more alert. The alien slowly raised a three-fingered hand, indicating a panel on the ship's large, mostly inert core that sat hidden beneath the hay. The CNM, or Core Navigational Matrix. The panel was smooth, black, and absorbed all light. Vex focused, and the panel subtly shifted, revealing 3 deep connection ports, humming slightly. Dale felt the mental communication again, clearer this time. Direct power feed required. Maximum amperage. Duration, 90 seconds. Failure to achieve full saturation means the distress signal will fail to propagate past the upper atmosphere. Discovery is assured. The intensity of the demand shook Dale. He was being asked to turn his entire property into a massive capacitor, risking fire, electrocution, and a localized power failure that would certainly alert the grid operators, if not the local police. 90 seconds, Dale muttered, checking his watch. That's enough time to burn down the goddamn county. He began calculating the logistics. He needed heavy-gauge wire, robust enough to handle the surge, and specialized clamps. The only place he had materials like that was locked in the shed, used for welding heavy machinery. The next step wasn't about stealth, it was about brute force and speed, a high-risk gamble that would be visible and noisy to anyone monitoring electrical traffic in the area. Dale retrieved his tools, heavy rubber-handled pliers, thick-gauge copper wiring, and a dangerous-looking set of alligator clamps rated for industrial use. He moved with a speed his heavy body usually reserved for crises, driven by a primal need for self-preservation mingled with a bizarre loyalty to the silent alien. The critical connection point was the main service entrance wire, a thick cable running from the utility pole straight into the pump house panel. This cable fed the entire property, bypassing the smaller breakers that governed the house lights and well pump. Bypassing it would deliver raw, unrestricted amperage. He had to work quickly and with absolute precision. A single slip meant instant electrocution and vaporizing himself into a fine mist. He put on thick leather gloves, despite the heat. The air in the pump house was humid and smelled of oil and metal. Dale opened the service panel, revealing the thick, insulated bus bars. The tension was suffocating, every scrape of metal against metal sounding deafening in the early morning quiet. He connected the heavy-gauge wires to the bus bars, running them out of the pump house and across the dewy grass towards the barn door, a crude, live circuit snaking towards the interstellar craft. The sheer illegality and risk of the act made his hands tremble, but the image of Vex's massive black eyes watching him was a constant, terrifying motivator. Backlight flicker. Dale entered the barn, pulling the heavy, live cable behind him. It took immense effort to prevent the exposed end from touching the damp floor or the metal siding. Vex observed the process, the faintest hint of what Dale interpreted as anticipation reflected in the black eyes. Dale stripped the ends of the cable with a practiced, quick slice of the knife, revealing the raw copper strands. He then attached the heavy clamps. He knelt by the CNM, connecting the two clamps to the designated ports. He noticed a faint static charge building around the CNM, the air grew dry and sharp. One port remained unconnected, the initiation switch. He looked back at Vex, who gave the slight, imperceptible nod that communicated everything. Dale felt the sudden urge to vomit. This was the point of no return. Once connected, he had precisely 90 seconds to hope the system worked before the utility pole transformer blew, or his wiring caught fire, or the sheer localized magnetic field alerted military satellites scanning for anomalies. He checked his watch. August 17, 2025 4:59 and 11 seconds AM. Almost 5 o'clock. Dawn was moments away. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the humid barn air burning his lungs. The fate of Vex, and the quiet existence of Dale Kincaid, rested on the efficiency of 90 seconds of stolen electricity. Vex used a burst of visible energy, a pale blue light emanating from the tips of the 3 fingers, guiding Dale's hand toward the final, crucial connection. Dale hesitated for just a moment, picturing the ensuing explosion. Then, driven past fear by exhaustion and necessity, he slammed the final clamp onto the terminal. The barn immediately plunged into terrifying chaos. A violent, electrical snap echoed like a gunshot. The thick copper wire running across the floor instantly began to vibrate, heating up rapidly. The CNM exploded into a dazzling, contained light, white and intensely blue, that forced Dale to throw an arm over his eyes. The ESU's hum turned into a high-pitched, screaming whine, overwhelming the sound of the crickets. Outside, Dale heard the unmistakable dull thud of the well pump shutting down, then the distant, sharp pop of circuit breakers failing down the road. Localized blackout was confirmed. Vex's entire body began to glow with the same internal white-blue light, veins visible and pulsing fiercely against the translucent skin. The signal sequence had initiated. Dale scrambled back, hitting the wall, watching the digital readout on the CNM, a complex, rapidly counting timer that read 00:88, tick downward, confirming the dangerous, desperate countdown had begun. The heat was becoming unbearable, and the smell of superheated copper and ozone filled the barn, promising fire any second. September 4, 2025, 3:17:41 a.m. The timestamp flickers wildly, reacting to the intermittent power fluctuations caused by Vex setting up the surge conduit. Dale, still dizzy and heavy-lidded from his collapse, levered himself upright against the workshop bench. Vex stood near the back wall, near where the heavy gauge wire now ran from the ship's component. Through the drywall, and directly toward the main electrical conduit serving the barn. Vex's large, black eyes tracked Dale's movements, projecting a sense of focused, critical impatience. Vex extended a long, slender arm, pointing a three-fingered hand toward the corner, then making a quick, decisive downward motion. The nonverbal message was clear: the connection had to be complete now, and the primary electrical disconnect had to be thrown, bypassing the fuses that would instantly vaporize under the load. Dale's breath hitched. He knew what Vex was asking. It wasn't just about blowing a circuit, it was about pulling enough current to potentially start a fire, maybe even burn out the transformer half a mile down the road. It was reckless, final, and absolutely necessary. He wiped the sweat from his salt and pepper buzz cut. All right, just gimme a second, Vex. Don't want to burn down 40 years of accumulated junk just yet. He moved slowly, picking up the thick, rubber-handled knife and the spool of industrial wire Vex had sourced from the shed earlier. September 4, 2025, 3:25:09 a.m. The air in the workshop grew taut, the low hum from the newly connected alien device vibrating through the concrete floor. Dale was perched on a shaky milk crate, wrestling with the main breaker panel located just inside the barn door. He had stripped the insulation from the feeder line, exposing the heavy copper core. The risk assessment was screaming in his mind: this wire was rated for 300 amps, maybe, but Vex needed thousands, instantly, for the duration of the beacon pulse. He spliced Vex's conduit line directly onto the exposed feeder. As the copper strands met, a small, violent shower of blue sparks erupted, startling Dale and causing him to stumble back slightly on the crate. Vex made a soft, clicking sound, a sound Dale now understood as severe agitation. Dale steadied himself, his heavy chest heaving. Relax, I got it. Just friction. He used several thick wraps of electrical tape, overkill perhaps, but the primal fear of shorting out the grid was overwhelming. Once secured, he climbed down, looking back at the makeshift connection, an ugly, dangerous knot of black and copper leading from his house, through the barn, and into an alien vessel component. He walked over to the massive, levered disconnect switch, meant for emergency shutoff of the entire property. This wasn't emergency shutoff, this was emergency overload dash. September 4, 2025, 3:30:15 a.m. Vex drifted closer to the component, now radiating a low, cold blue light that pulsed rhythmically, slowly gathering energy. Vex looked at Dale, their large, reflective eyes holding an intensity Dale had never witnessed. There was no hesitation now, only the overwhelming requirement for instantaneous action. Vex raised their arms slowly, pausing only when the elongated three-fingered hand was held parallel to the ground, and then sharply dropped it. The signal. Dale swallowed hard. He placed both hands on the heavy, stiff handle of the disconnect switch. His faded blue work shirt was damp with sweat under the straps of his suspenders. Okay, Vex. We burn the house down. Hope your people are worth it, he muttered, taking a final, deep breath. With a grunt that strained his heavy frame, Dale threw the switch downward. The resulting sound was immediate and terrifying, a deafening thwump followed by a scorching, metallic shriek. Every light bulb in the barn, workshop, and presumably the house simultaneously surged into an explosive white flash before popping violently into darkness. Fuses along the main panel detonated with loud, sharp reports, showering the immediate area with sparks and acrid smoke. The recording device's timestamp immediately vanished, replaced by the persistent, frantic, bat low message. 3:31 and 2 seconds a.m., bat low. The only illumination left came from the alien component itself. It wasn't the soft, pulsing blue anymore, it was a blinding, deep sapphire vortex of light contained within the mechanism Vex had repaired. The light cast Vex's slender, 6.5-foot figure into sharp, skeletal relief, emphasizing the visibility of the faint blue veins beneath their translucent skin. Vex was vibrating slightly, channeling immense energy. A low, penetrating hum, too deep to be heard, only felt, resonated through the ground, vibrating Dale's teeth. The air temperature plummeted several degrees, replaced by the sterile, sharp odor of ozone and severely burned insulation. Dale stumbled back, coughing from the smoke, retreating toward the workshop entrance. He saw the main power line connection he had spliced moments ago glowing cherry red, the tape around it instantly carbonized. Outside, the night was eerily silent, save for the massive, rhythmic drain. The sheer force of the current draw caused the component to emit a focused, vertical beam of cobalt light that pierced the decaying barn roof in a perfect circle, vaporizing the shingles and wood instantly. The beacon was active. Vex had done it. 3:34 and 55 seconds a.m.,